The rope burned into Thomas Brennan's palms as he hauled the last fence post upright. His shoulders ached from 3 days of rebuilding what the fire had taken, but he didn't stop, couldn't stop. Behind him, the charred skeleton of his barn stood like a monument to everything the town wanted him to abandon. The wood was still warm when he touched it, embers buried deep in the collapsed timbers, refusing to die completely. They'd come in the night, masked men on horseback, torches held high. They'd surrounded his property and set the blaze while he stood in the doorway with his rifle, knowing that if he fired a single shot, they'd hang him by morning. So he'd watched it burn, watched 20 years of work turn to ash and smoke. And when they rode away, one of them had shouted back through the darkness, "Stop this now, Brennan, or next time it's the house." Thomas straightened, wiping sweat from his brow with a dirt-stained hand. His reflection caught in the water trough, gaunt face, grey beard streaked with soot, eyes that hadn't slept properly in weeks. He looked like a man who'd already lost, but the land stretched out before him, rolling hills covered in tall grass where his cattle grazed peacefully, and beyond that, the rocky outcrop where the spring fed clear water year-round. This wasn't just property, it was survival, it was freedom, and he'd die before he let them take it. The town of Grafton sat 5 miles east, tucked into a valley where the railroad had brought prosperity and corruption in equal measure. Samuel Garrett owned most of it now, the bank, the general store, the saloon, half the farmland surrounding the town limits. He wanted Thomas's land too, wanted the water rights that came with it, had offered to buy it 3 times at prices that insulted more than they tempted. When Thomas refused, Garrett had turned the town against him, spread rumors, made accusations, called him a squatter, a cheat, a man who couldn't be trusted. And now the fire had come, and Thomas knew it was only the beginning. He drove another post into the ground, the hammer striking with rhythmic precision. Each blow was a refusal, each nail was defiance. The sun climbed higher, turning the valley into a furnace, but Thomas didn't seek shade. Pain was clarity, exhaustion was purpose. He'd spent too many years drifting after the war, wandering from town to town with nothing to call his own. This land had given him a second chance, and he wouldn't surrender it to men who measured worth only in coins and deeds. Before you continue with Thomas's journey, I want to take a moment to connect with you. Comment below and let me know what city or country you're watching from. It truly means the world to hear where this story reaches. If you enjoy these tales of resilience and the Old West, please subscribe to the channel and hit that like button. Your support keeps these stories alive, and every notification means another voice joining this community we're building together. 3 days after the fire, Martha Collins rode into Thomas's property on a grey mare. She was a widow, 60 years old, with hands that had worked fabric and needle for 4 decades. She dismounted slowly, her face drawn with worry, and approached where Thomas was hammering new boards onto the fence line. "Thomas," she said quietly. Her voice carried the weight of bad news. He set down the hammer and turned to face her. "Martha, I came to warn you." She glanced back toward the road as if expecting to see someone following. "There's talk in town. Garrett's stirring people up. Says you're hoarding water during the dry season, keeping it from families who need it." Thomas's jaw tightened. "That's a lie. My spring feeds into the creek. Everyone downstream benefits." "I know that. You know that. But Garrett's got the mayor's ear now, and folks are scared. Crops are struggling. Animals are dying. They're looking for someone to blame." Martha stepped closer, her eyes pleading. "He's calling a town meeting tomorrow night. Says he's going to put it to a vote, whether you should be forced to sell or face consequences." The word hung between them like a noose. "Consequences," Thomas repeated, tasting the bitterness of it. "Please," Martha said, reaching out to touch his arm. "Just come to the meeting. Speak for yourself. Some people will listen. I'll speak for you. Others will too." Thomas looked past her toward the hills. Storm clouds were gathering on the horizon, dark and promising. Rain would change everything. Rain would prove the drought wasn't his fault. But the sky had been promising rain for 6 weeks, and every morning brought only more sun and dust. "I'll be there," he said finally. Martha nodded, relief flickering across her face. But it died quickly when she saw his expression, the set of his jaw, the steel in his gaze. "Don't do anything foolish," she warned. "I'm just going to tell the truth." "The truth won't be enough if they've already made up their minds." Thomas picked up his hammer again. "Then we'll see what they're really made of." Martha mounted her horse and rode away, dust rising behind her like smoke. Thomas returned to his work, but his hands moved slower now. He was building more than a fence. He was building a stand, a line that couldn't be crossed. And tomorrow night, the town would decide which side of that line they stood on. The town hall was packed when Thomas arrived. Every bench was filled, people standing along the walls, pressed shoulder to shoulder in the stifling heat. Lamplight cast long shadows across faces he'd known for years. Neighbors, fellow ranchers, shopkeepers who'd sold him supplies and shaken his hand. Tonight they wouldn't meet his eyes. Samuel Garrett stood at the front, dressed in a fine suit that looked out of place among the worn work clothes of everyone else. He was a tall man, broad-shouldered, with silver hair swept back and a smile that never reached his eyes. When Thomas entered, Garrett's smile widened. "Ah, Mr. Brennan, good of you to join us." Thomas walked down the center aisle, his boots loud on the wooden floor. He found a space near the back and stood with his arms crossed, waiting. Mayor Hutchins cleared his throat from behind the podium. He was a small man, balding, who'd held office for 12 years by never making enemies and never taking stands. "Let's begin," he said nervously. "We're here to discuss the water situation, and Mr. Garrett has some concerns he'd like to address." Garrett stepped forward, commanding the room without effort. "Thank you, Mayor. I'll be brief." He turned to face the crowd. "We're in crisis. Worst drought in 20 years. Families are struggling, livestock dying. And yet, one man sits on the best water source in the county and refuses to share." "That's not true," Thomas said, his voice cutting through the murmurs. Garrett's smile thinned. "Isn't it? Your spring produces enough water for 100 families, yet you keep it for yourself and your cattle. The creek flows downstream. Everyone benefits from it." "A trickle," Garrett countered, "when you could be channeling water directly to the town. When you could be helping your neighbors in their time of need." "I offered to help dig irrigation ditches last month," Thomas said, stepping forward. "Offered my own labor. You turned me down." "Because we need the water source itself, not charity." Garrett's voice rose. "This isn't about ditches, Brennan. This is about you thinking you're above the community, above the needs of families." "What you're really saying," Thomas replied slowly, "is that you want my land. You want control of the water so you can sell it back to the same people you're pretending to help." The room erupted in shouts and arguments. Mayor Hutchins banged his gavel uselessly. Garrett raised his hands for calm, his expression one of wounded innocence. "See what we're dealing with?" he said. "Paranoia, selfishness. While children go thirsty, this man accuses me of—" "Where were you 3 nights ago?" Thomas interrupted. The room fell silent. Garrett's face hardened. "I beg your pardon? 3 nights ago, when my barn burned down. Where were you?" "I was at home, as any decent man would be." "Can anyone verify that? Are you accusing me of arson?" Garrett's voice dripped with indignation. In front of all these witnesses? Thomas met his gaze steadily. I'm asking a question. This is outrageous. Garrett turned to the mayor. You see what we're dealing with. The man is unhinged, dangerous even. Martha Collins stood from her seat near the front. Thomas Brennan is no danger to anyone. I've known him for 15 years. He's honest, hard-working. Then why won't he help us? Someone shouted from the back. Why should we trust him? Another voice added. The tide was turning. Thomas could feel it in the room. The anger, the fear, the desperation of people looking for someone to blame. Garrett had planted the seeds carefully, and now they were bearing fruit. I propose a vote, Garrett said, his voice reasonable again. The town should decide. Either Mr. Brennan agrees to sell his land at fair market value, or we petition the territorial government to seize it for the public good. You can't do that, Thomas said. Actually, Mayor Hutchins said weakly, there is legal precedent. In times of emergency. This isn't an emergency. This is theft. Call it what you want, Garrett said, but the people will decide. The vote was called. Hands rose throughout the room, a forest of agreement. Martha kept her hands down, along with a handful of others, old ranchers, a few shopkeepers, people who remembered what justice looked like, but they were outnumbered 3-1. Motion passes, Mayor Hutchins announced, his voice barely audible. Thomas stood motionless, watching them. These were his neighbors, people he'd helped during hard times, people he'd traded with, shared meals with, and now they were voting to destroy him because it was easier than standing up to Samuel Garrett. You have 1 week, Garrett said, turning to face Thomas directly. Sell or lose everything. Thomas walked toward the door. The crowd parted for him, no one willing to stand too close. As he reached the exit, he turned back one last time. This land belonged to my father, he said quietly. He died protecting it from men like you. I won't dishonor his memory by giving it up because you scared these people into betraying what's right. Then you're a fool, Garrett replied. Maybe, Thomas said, but I'll be a free fool. He walked out into the night, leaving the town to its shame. The week passed like a slow execution. Each day Thomas worked his land knowing it might be the last time. He repaired what could be repaired, tended his cattle, drew water from the spring, and watched it flow downstream toward people who'd voted to take everything from him. On the third day, a small group arrived. 3 young men from town, barely 20 years old, carrying rifles and looking uncomfortable. Mr. Brennan, the tallest one said, his voice cracking, Mr. Garrett sent us to make sure you're not causing any trouble. Thomas looked at them from where he was mending fence wire. Trouble like what? Like, The young man glanced at his companions. Like poisoning the water, or damming it up. You think I'd do that, Mr. Garrett says, I don't care what Garrett says. Thomas returned to his work. The water flows free, same as always. You can check if you want. They didn't check. They just stood there, uncertain, until finally they retreated to the property line and set up a makeshift camp. Guards, watching a man who'd done nothing wrong. That night, Martha returned. She brought food wrapped in cloth and news from town. There's division now, she said as they sat on Thomas's porch. People are starting to question whether this is right. The Johnsons spoke up at church, said forcing a sale was the same as stealing. Won't matter, Thomas said. Garrett owns the law here. Maybe not forever. Martha set down her basket. I've been writing letters. To the territorial governor, to newspapers in the big cities. This story needs to be told beyond Grafton. Thomas looked at her with something like gratitude. Why are you doing this? It'll make you a target too. Because I watched my husband die in the war, fighting for what he believed in, Martha said firmly. I won't watch another good man be destroyed by cowards while I do nothing." They sat in silence, watching the stars emerge above the valley. Tomorrow would be the 4th day. 3 more remained. On the 6th day, the rain finally came. It started as a whisper, distant thunder rolling across the hills. Then the clouds broke open and water fell in sheets, soaking the parched earth, filling the creek beds, drumming on the roof of Thomas's cabin like 1,000 fingers tapping out a message. Vindication. Thomas stood in the downpour, arms spread, face turned skyward. The drought was broken. The excuse was gone. But he knew it wouldn't matter. Garrett had never cared about water. He wanted the land, the power, the control, and he wouldn't stop because the weather changed. That night they came again, not with torches this time, but with something worse, legal documents and armed men wearing deputy badges. Samuel Garrett rode at their head, rainwater streaming off his hat, his expression grim with purpose. "Thomas Brennan," he called out, "by order of the Territorial Court, this property is hereby seized for non-payment of outstanding debts and taxes." Thomas stepped onto the porch, his rifle across his arms. "What debts? What taxes?" Garrett produced papers, official-looking, stamped and signed. "Records show you owe the county $1,200 in back taxes, never paid, and loans from the bank totaling another $3,000. Those are forgeries." Thomas's voice was steady, but his heart hammered. "I paid those taxes. I never took loans from your bank. You can dispute it in court after you vacate the property. I'm not leaving." The deputies shifted uncomfortably. These were local men, doing work they didn't believe in for money they needed. One of them, Jacob Pierce, had been Thomas's friend once. Their eyes met, and Thomas saw shame there, but not enough to change anything. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be," Garrett said. "We can remove you by force if necessary." Thomas raised the rifle slowly, not aiming, just holding it ready. "You'll have to." The rain hammered down around them. Thunder cracked. Lightning illuminated 12 men on horseback, all armed, all waiting for the order. Garrett's hand moved toward his pistol. Then Martha Collins stepped out of the darkness, followed by 15 others, ranchers, farmers, townspeople. They positioned themselves between Thomas and Garrett's men, unarmed but resolute. "You'll have to go through all of us," Martha said. Garrett's face twisted with fury. "You're interfering with legal proceedings." "We're witnessing fraud," said an old rancher named Coleman. "I paid Thomas's taxes myself last year, watched him hand the money to the county clerk." "Those records are sealed," Garrett snapped. "Then unseal them," Martha said. "In daylight, in front of witnesses who can read." "This is absurd." "What's absurd," Coleman interrupted, "is 12 armed men coming to steal a man's land in the middle of the night because you want his water rights." The deputies were looking at each other now, uncertainty spreading. Jacob Pierce lowered his rifle slightly. "Stand down, Jacob," Garrett commanded. Jacob hesitated. Then, slowly, he holstered his weapon. "I'm not doing this, Mr. Garrett. Something's not right here." 2 other deputies followed suit, then another. Garrett's force was crumbling. "You're all making a mistake," Garrett said, his voice low and dangerous. "I own this town. I own your livelihoods. You think you can just—" "We think we can stand up for what's right," Martha said firmly, "and if that costs us, so be it." The rain continued to fall, washing the dust from the air, filling the creek that had run low for so long. In that moment, Thomas saw what he'd almost stopped believing existed. People choosing principle over comfort, justice over fear. Garrett stared at them all with pure hatred. Then he yanked his horse's reins and rode off into the darkness, his remaining men following. The deputies who'd stayed behind approached Thomas with apologies in their eyes. "We're sorry," Jacob said. "We should have questioned this from the start." Thomas lowered his rifle. "You questioned it when it mattered." The aftermath took months to resolve. Martha's letters reached the territorial governor, who ordered an investigation. The county clerk confessed under pressure that Garrett had paid him to falsify records. The bank documents were exposed as frauds. 3 judges were removed from office for corruption. Samuel Garrett fled before he could be arrested, disappearing into the territories where men with money could always find new places to exploit. Grafton slowly healed. The townspeople who'd stood with Garrett faced their shame in different ways, some with apologies, some with silence, some by never speaking of it again. But the town remembered. They remembered what had almost happened and what it said about them. Thomas rebuilt his barn with help from neighbors who came without being asked. Martha organized the work, bringing food and directing labor. Young men who'd been sent to guard him now hammered nails alongside him, trying to make amends. On a clear morning 6 months after the town meeting, Thomas stood at his property line and watched the sun rise over land that was still his. The grass had grown back thick and green from the rains that had continued through autumn. His cattle grazed peacefully. The spring flowed clear and cold, feeding the creek that supplied water to everyone downstream. Martha rode up, bringing fresh bread and news. "The governor appointed a new mayor," she said. "Hutchins resigned. They want someone who can't be bought." "Did they find anyone?" Martha smiled. "They asked me." Thomas laughed, the sound rusty but genuine. "You said yes." "I said I'd think about it, but I probably will." She dismounted and stood beside him, looking out over the valley. "Someone has to make sure this doesn't happen again." "It will happen again," Thomas said quietly. "Somewhere else. To someone else. Then they'll have to fight like you did. And maybe some people will stand with them like we stood with you." Thomas nodded. He knew she was right. Evil didn't disappear just because you defeated it once, but neither did goodness, neither did courage. The same people who'd voted against him had also, in the end, chosen to protect him. That had to mean something. "Your father would be proud," Martha said. Thomas thought about that. His father had died defending this land from raiders during the war, bleeding out while Thomas held him and promised to never let it go. For years, that promise had felt like a burden, a chain keeping him tied to a piece of earth. But now he understood it differently. The land wasn't just property. It was a test of character. It was the question every person eventually faced, when pressed, when threatened, when given every reason to surrender. Will you stand? "I hope so," Thomas said. "I hope he's watching." They stood together in comfortable silence as the sun climbed higher, burning off the morning mist. In the distance, Thomas could see other ranches, other homesteads, smoke rising from chimneys where families were waking to another day of hard work and uncertain futures. The West was filling up with people looking for fresh starts, for land of their own, for freedom they couldn't find back east. Some of them would make it, some wouldn't. Some would become the very thing they'd fled from. But that was the gamble everyone took when they came out here, that the land would make them better instead of harder, that survival wouldn't cost them their humanity. Thomas had almost lost that gamble, had come within one night of losing everything. But he'd held on, not just to the land, but to the belief that it was worth defending, not for its own sake, but for what it represented. The right to build something with your own hands, the right to say no to powerful men who thought everything had a price, the right to be left alone to live free. "Stop this now," Martha said suddenly, a bitter smile on her face. "That's what Garrett's man told you, wasn't it?" "Yes. And you refused." Thomas nodded. I did. Cost you everything. And I got it back. He glanced at her. Because of people like you. Martha looked uncomfortable with the praise. I just did what any decent person should do. That's rarer than you think. They stood there longer, watching the valley come alive. The rain had brought more than water. It had brought clarity. The town had demanded justice, and in the end, they'd gotten it. Not the justice Garrett had tried to manufacture, but the real thing. The kind that required sacrifice and courage, and people willing to stand in the rain between a man and those who wanted to destroy him. Thomas Brennan had fought for his land and won. But more than that, he'd fought for his soul and kept it intact. In a place where the line between right and wrong was often drawn in gun smoke and blood, that might have been the greater victory. He turned toward his cabin, where smoke was already rising from the chimney. There was work to do. There was always work to do, but today, for the first time in months, it felt like hope instead of burden. Martha mounted her horse. I'll be back next week. We're having a barn dance. You should come. I'll think about it, Thomas said, knowing he wouldn't. But he appreciated the invitation. As she rode away, Thomas walked back toward his home, his boots crunching on gravel still damp from last night's rain. The rope scars on his hands had faded, but not disappeared. They'd be there forever, a reminder of the week he'd rebuilt his fence while the town decided whether to destroy him. Some scars were worth keeping. They told the stories that mattered. And sometimes, when you refused to stop, when told to stop, when you stood your ground even when the whole town turned against you, those scars became proof that you'd lived according to something deeper than fear. Thomas Brennan had overcome more than a corrupt businessman and a cowardly town. He'd overcome the temptation to give up on what mattered just because fighting for it was hard. That was a victory that would last longer than any property deed. The sun continued to rise, painting the valley gold. And Thomas got back to work.